Hello, protocols, packets, and programs. It's the shortest month, so let's waste no time to ask, Conan, what is best in threat modeling? To crush your SREs, to see them questioned before you, and to hear the lamentations of their metrics. Which means this week we chat with Sandy Carielli and Akira Brand on some less barbaric approaches to the practice of threat modeling. Contemplate this, and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest Appsec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly. IT professionals, mark your calendars. Zero Trust World 2025 is happening in Orlando, Florida, February 19th to 21st. This event is tailored for IT leaders and cybersecurity experts who want actionable insights on zero trust strategies, practical solutions for modern threats, and meaningful connections with industry peers. Plus, take advantage of hands-on cyber hero boot camps, expert-led sessions, and the chance to earn CPE credits and your Cyber Hero certificate. Save $200 on your in-person registration using discount code ZTWSW25 at securityweekly.com/ZTW2025. Reserve your spot now.
This is episode 316, recorded February 3rd, 2025. I'm your host, Mike Shima, and I'm here with Kalyani Pawar. Hello, Kalyani.
Hello, happy to be here.
Happy as always to start a Monday with you. And also, it's a Monday, so that means we have an announcement. Security Weekly listeners, save $100 on your RSA Conference 2025 full conference pass. RSAC will take place April 28th to May 1st in San Francisco and on demand. To register using our discount code, visit securityweekly.com/RSAC25 and use the code 5U5SecWeekly. We hope to see you there. Sandy is a principal analyst at Forrester, advising security and risk professionals on application security with a particular emphasis on the collaboration among security and risk, application development, operations, and business teams. Her research covers topics such as proactive security design, security testing in the SDLC, protecting apps, and remediating hardware and software flaws. Hello, Sandy. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mike. Great to be here again.
Happy to have you here again. And speaking of people we have here again, Akira is an Appsec leader at PRA Group and responsible for leading Appsec initiatives across a globally distributed team. And of course, she's a former co-host of the show. Hello, Akira. Thank you as well.
Hi, Mike. It's so good to be here.
So good to have you. And as I alluded to in the opening, we're going to talk about threat modeling. And Sandy, I want to start with you with a little bit of history. So Appsec has relied on the two-question threat model for a long time, as in, what are you building and did you complete the checklist I gave you? I want to ask, what's so wrong with that, and what are orgs doing today that could possibly improve on such an approach?
God, the checklist thing. I got to tell you, Mike, when I started doing the threat modeling research, the checklist thing was the biggest hangover about threat modeling. It was the reason that people looked down on it, viewed it as negative, because when it's checklist model, it's not actionable. It becomes this thing that people do and you put it in a drawer somewhere and you don't do anything with it. And it's just seen as being done for its own sake, rather than what the purpose of a threat model should be is to create an actionable set of steps to make the application safer. So what we're seeing now for people that are really looking to adopt threat modeling is much more integration with the dev team and really focusing on making the application more secure, working better with development so you can actually get product out faster rather than running into all these last minute fire drills because you didn't catch things sooner. And yeah, there's sometimes a compliance element to it, but the compliance element also ties to getting through your auditor requirements faster because you've already addressed a lot of the questions that they might have for you.
No, I appreciate that. I do want to start off with maybe talking about that angle about that combination of the misconceptions about what threat modeling is or could be to make it useful and what its outcome is. Because you were highlighting the outcome, let's make it safer, make it more secure. Now, we do need to tease out maybe some specifics around there. And it's the sense of what does it mean to be safer? So in here, I want to come to the idea of there is the 4-question model. What are you building? What could go wrong? What are we going to do about it? How well did we do? But a lot of that would be, did you deal with XSS? Or did you do input validation? As I start to pull out these types of questions, Akira, you doing this, these threat modeling practices with developers, are these the type of questions that I just rattled off that you're talking to developers about, or what are the useful questions or useful conversations you're having that builds a threat model?
The most important question that I'm finding is that we're actually threat modeling the right thing, right? So all of these questions are completely irrelevant if you are not threat modeling business logic that is relevant to, let's say, the roadmap for the next quarter, 2 quarters, year, whatever it is. So yeah, you can find XSS all over your app, but if it's not a priority for the business to be releasing the features that you're finding XSS in, no one cares.
Yeah, and part of the reason I bring that up too is you've also got a lot of scanners that can do that for you. So why not just run the scanner and have those conversations on business logic, which makes me wonder then, I did mention the 4-question model. Sandy, you did this research talking with a bunch of different organizations, a bunch of different folks who are doing successfully or not threat modeling. Are there frameworks that they follow? What's the guidance that you found that they use?
This was, in my mind, Mike, one of the most interesting aspects of the research, because I went into this and I asked everyone I spoke to, what frameworks are you familiar with? What frameworks are you using? Are you using Stride? Are you using Dread? Are you using one of the main frameworks out there? And almost everyone I spoke to said, nope, not using any of those. Some of the folks that had the most nuance to it would say to me that if they had brand new teams, maybe mostly developers that were leading the threat modeling exercises, they might start with something like Stride just to get everyone familiar with what threat modeling is. But long term, once people understood the point of threat modeling, the frameworks were too heavy. And most folks that I spoke to didn't use a framework. And that, I think, was the most interesting takeaway, because I went into this wondering if I was going to be recommending a particular framework, developing a different framework, any of that. We don't need that. What we need is more of those questions that you started with. What's the purpose of the application? What is it intended to do? How could it be breached in some way? What are the potential threats? And then, very importantly, what's the impact of those, and how do you prioritize that impact in order to actually understand what you should be doing? Because the goal shouldn't be to fix everything under the sun. You use threat modeling to prioritize, which then allows you to, surprise, surprise, work faster.
Well, and you're starting to bring out another angle I want to go down, in the sense of you don't need to fix everything. This is already, we have vuln scanning that already creates too much noise for us. But what about threat modeling everything? How do you know when you're done threat modeling? How do you know you talked about the right areas or asked enough of the questions about the business logic or the features or something else? When can you stop and feel like I'm done and we did sufficient?
That's a really good question. You go ahead.
Yeah, no,
you on it. So you go.
I mean, what I would say is you're never going to, don't assume that you're ever going to find 100% of the threats.
Fair.
That's not the point of it. So the point isn't really to be done. I spoke to people who said, look, use it to find 80% of the stuff. Treat this as a layer of defense in depth. And I think that is a large part of it. I think, again, one of the other misconceptions and hangovers with threat modeling is that when something is found that wasn't discovered in the threat model, the backlash is, well, threat modeling isn't useful then. Well, no, it's a layer. It addresses certain aspects of it. But there is some element to, are you doing enough? And I think it's as much about having a good understanding. Are you covering all of the key elements of what the product does? Mm-hmm. That's where I would start. If you're covering the elements of who uses the product and what regions and what the business purpose is and who you're connected to. If you're asking questions around all of that, you're probably hitting a lot of it.
I would also say that it's a good idea to time box threat modeling so it doesn't just continue to go on and on and on.
Yes.
Maybe you have 2 1-hour sessions and you get as much done as you possibly can in those sessions and then you're done. Because the speed at which software releases, you cannot slow the velocity down and stay on your developers and your business advocates' good side, right? So try to do it in a time boxed way that is repetitive for everybody. And I think that that will earn you not only the respect of the developers, but it will also get you moving forward in a way where you have maybe iteration 0, iteration 1, and maybe iteration 2. Threat modeling functionally is just sad path testing, in my opinion. So we have happy path testing in software, and then we have sad path testing. And threat model is like the big sad, right? So we also don't
I
need
like
to
that.
be necessarily using, like as Sandy iterated earlier, we don't necessarily need to be using these really heavy frameworks. If anything, we can take our findings from the threat model and turn it into unit tests for SADPath, right? So that's a great way to know, okay, did we do this threat model well, in as much as did we get maybe some of the unit tests of a business critical section of the application written so that we can take the findings and just test for them. And then maybe we make our own testing library down the road, right? So we have these consistent tests that we've already written that we can actually put in the code. And like we were alluding to earlier, Mike, you said, let the machines do it, which is incredibly important because we cannot threat model every single feature. It's just not possible. But if we start to build a library of testing suites that we can use over and over again, maybe with some minor tweaks here and there for sad path testing, based on what we found in the threat model, I think we're going to be in pretty good shape.
Yeah, and I think that sad path is really, and that idea of unit testing is these are behavior specific to the application, right? It's not just a generic input validation. Let's do some garbage SQL injection cross-site scripting. And Kalyani, I know I would love to hear, how much of this is resonating from you, and how have you seen this work out in practice?
Exactly where I was coming from. This is the direction I was headed. I feel like a bunch of startups that I've worked with have always been short on resources, right? Because they don't probably have the time to make a testing library, let alone, even forget unit testing. It's harder to see good unit tests written in the code base. I think the most common approach to threat modeling I've seen is that, okay, we're releasing a new big feature, and that has to do with like really critical business logic or any critical security function. And so let's threat model this. Or when you're introducing threat modeling for the first time, a concept as a whole to the whole organization, right? And I've seen this happen even in like 700 devs versus 5 security engineers kind of organization. So I think my follow-up to that would be, if you're short on resources, what would be a good model of iteration to ensure coverage?
Ooh, can I jump in on that one?
Yeah, for sure.
Because thank you for that, Kalyani, because that allows me to talk about one of my favorite approaches that I heard in the course of the research I did for the report that I did on this, which was from a former CISO who said that he had a lot of success working threat modeling into daily and weekly stand-ups.
Oh,
So that it wasn't a separate set of meetings, separate set of people. It was have security join the stand-up and just ask a couple of the questions. And it's not going to be a, thorough 100% do everything, but you'll cover a lot of ground in the course of asking a couple of questions at the end of a stand-up once a week. You're going to get further along. And that, I think, addresses some of the potential resourcing issues, but it also, you already have this cadence of meetings where, in theory, development and architecture and security and the key people you would want involved are already together. Take advantage of that. Don't make them come together again. Nobody wants more meetings.
Right.
and it's a great way to time box it, to reinforce what Akira was saying. And part of that too, then that leads me to the idea of doing it during stand-ups. Sounds and feels like a great way to scale it. Now, I don't know that Kalyani and Akira can go to every single stand-up that all of their dev teams have, but at least to seed, demonstrate how to start the conversation feels like it'd be smart. But I wonder then too, how does the scaling work? Because we talked about frameworks just need to be lightweight. Use that 4-question model. Maybe use Stride or Dread, which is even not so great, to get people familiar with vocabulary. But if you have a lot of people, are there tools out there? Do we go in the direction of tools that make threat modeling work for us, do this for us, other than just having it being a checklist to say, yeah, we did it?
I think it's a good idea to use tooling. I also think it's a good idea to decide for your company when you need to scale, right? Because sometimes we have this constant mindset that we need to grow and grow and grow and grow. But if the organization isn't necessarily growing, like if you're not adding more developers to the team, if you aren't, like maybe you're doing a couple sprints of fixing things on the backlog, that's not necessarily the time where we need to scale. So as far as how to scale, that's one thing, but maybe to take the conversation a little different, we don't have to address this right now. But knowing when to scale is also really important. And then if you know when and how to, like if you know when to scale, the how I think will present itself much more logically.
I like that point. Yeah. There's a lot you can do pre-scaling with, an Excel spreadsheet and SharePoint to store artifacts. I mean, some of the tooling, there are threat modeling tools out there. There are a number of them. And to your point, Akira, they're great when you're ready to scale.
Yeah.
But if you haven't got your threat modeling program in place, if you don't have the process and the people on board, you're spending on a tool that isn't going to get well used. The tools are great for building architecture diagrams, building data flow diagrams, discovering artifacts, bringing everything together, having the formal flow for it. But if you're going to do that, you need people bought into the threat modeling program first. You need people who understand the questions to be asking, a lot of that stuff. So I like the tools, but I think even a lot of the folks who make those tools available will acknowledge that they're best for programs that are already maturing.
And I draw that parallel to things like a bug bounty. You don't start a bug bounty if you haven't yet done any AppSec work, if you haven't run any of the SAST or DAST tools or SCA tools on your own first, because otherwise you're just subsidizing everybody out there randomly to run against your network.
And
on that,
also a financial nightmare because you probably don't know how much to pay out.
yes.
Yeah, it's expensive.
Yeah.
And that brings up another angle to me too, in the sense of what are the conversations like? And here I want to come with the angle of threat modeling can also just be a subtle way of security awareness, or call it security education. Because Sandy, you alluded to like using Stride, like what is spoofing, tampering? Maybe these are just examples and some vocabulary for developers to learn and start to reuse and figure out how do I apply this to what I'm building. But I imagine that the conversations with a senior architect and a junior developer might be a bit different when you're threat modeling. And I don't want to necessarily exclude either one. They're all part of a stand-up, for example. But does who you're talking to change the tenor, or how does it change how you might approach threat modeling? Is that an important angle to consider through all this?
I think yes, in that a more senior developer or an architect will understand the dependencies of the application against itself, right? Whereas a junior dev may just be slogging through code, trying to understand the code base itself, doing, fixes, writing tests, and may not have an overall big picture view of how the application works together. I think that this is kind of a really basic concept that I think you can teach a junior dev from a senior dev, not from the security person, but teaching the junior dev, how the application works together, and then educating them on what a trust boundary is. And since that's such an important entry point for so many threat models, like you can get through in trust boundaries, if you can teach them first off what a trust boundary is, and then help them identify where those are in your application, they're going to get bootstrapped very quickly into understanding the application as a whole.
That sounds like a wonderful departure point for a conversation, because yes, even as I mentioned bug bounties, sometimes a bug bounty report comes in, you're triaging it, you have to figure out, do we care? Until Kalyani's point, how much do we pay for this? Is this a $50, $500? Is this a t-shirt, or is this a $10,000? And saying, did this cross a trust boundary? Did this have consequences? Is a helpful way to talk through. Honestly, the developers probably have that type of knowledge of the app. They just haven't perhaps been forced to reason through it about what did we cross, and what bad thing happened here. So I wanted to highlight that, and maybe also use that as the departure point to talk about, especially I think a theme of your paper, your research here, Sandy, in the sense of, how do we get the business to care about this, or how do we show value to the business? And you mentioned compliance and checklists. Let's throw that aside. We're taking developers' time, whether we're doing it in a stand-up or not. Is this valuable?
Yeah, it's one of the things that if you're starting up a threat modeling program, probably the first thing you're going to have to do if you're the security lead is sell this to the rest of the business. Sell it to devs, sell it to product management, sell it to all of those stakeholders. And there are really three things that can drive that. The first one, yes, is the compliance element. And I would look at this two ways. One is if you have if you're subject to a regulation that requires you to do threat modeling, you have to do it anyway. And we can offer you a way to do it more effectively. We can help you do this in a way that isn't going to annoy you. There's also the element of, and this was something that was shared to me in the course of research, someone pointed out to me that they actually successfully used the threat model to push back on auditors, because they had an auditor come in and say, hey, we found this thing. What's the deal? What are you going to do about it? And they were able to take that threat model out and say, hey, we've addressed this. This is how we're doing it. So they could use the threat model as the rebuttal. And then that makes the audit and some of those checklist steps a little bit more efficient. And who doesn't love that? So that's the first part. The second part is just generally making the product more secure, safer. And again, that's something that nobody's against that. The other part of it, though, to your point, Mike, is we don't want to use up a lot of developer time. And so the third piece of this in terms of selling the value is, and this should be true of all AppSec, we can help you move faster. By addressing these issues now, we can make sure that there aren't going to be as many big fire drills that hold up things at the end. We know that your job is to get product in customers' hands as quickly as possible. So if we integrate this into the process, we can make the decisions on what to prioritize, what to spend time on, what not to spend time on, so that your developers don't have to fix things that don't need fixing. Also important. And we can generally help you be more efficient and faster. What developer wouldn't love that?
Yeah, a message from AppSec that says we're going to help you be faster just sounds sadly rare, as I'm going to laugh, but it sounds like really what we should be driving for. I'm curious, Carielli and then Akira, does this match up with your experience too, or have you had pushback from developers like, we don't, here's an unfortunate conversation, we don't want to talk to you, you are taking up our time, or you've been able to show them we're here to help and we're demonstrating that help?
Let the robots do it, and the developers will want to work with you, right? I've actually had a lot of pushback in my own job where I have introduced things like checklists. And the first thing I get is, that's great, no one's going to do them. You need to let the robots do it. And so if you can show up and show that you are open to automation, that you are empowering developers with automation, that you know that the architectural stage of the design process needs to be threat modeled, but you can also introduce automation to that, I think you'll have better success.
I would definitely plus one to that too. In my experience, I have seen simple things like even adding a few checklists to like maybe the PR sometimes helps a developer think. I mean, I know we're going towards source code reviews a little bit here, but to support that automation definitely looks like a business enabler initiative from AppSec rather than the usual Department of No sounding statements.
Well, that's also brings up a good point. How do we prove that we did this? So, because Sandy, you had that great example of talking to auditors. Hey, we've had this conversation. This is how we've dealt with this scenario. We're going to push back because the mitigations are in place, et cetera. Is this something that you need to, or that you'd recommend we point to the Git commits, like Kalyani just mentioned, or we just have a Google Doc? that we can point to, or Jira tickets? Has there been any more or less successful way of just capturing the artifacts of doing this?
I mean, as folks say, the second best tool for just about anything is Excel. And
Yeah.
that's a decent option for a lot of this. If you've got Jira tickets, that works as well. But having some sort of basic artifact that says these are the threats we've identified, these are the ones that have the highest impact, these are the ones that have the highest likelihood, these are the decisions we made on each of them, which ones did we fix, which ones did we mitigate with different other technologies or processes, which ones are we accepting risk on, and then have that list back to folks that ask, so that we have that as a living document. And by the way, updating that living document, not something that we put in a vault somewhere, something that we update as the application evolves. Yes, I think that it doesn't have to be fancy. You can use purpose-built tools, but you could also use Excel or a Word doc or Jira tickets.
I think something that is useful to point out too, and I've done threat modeling a good amount in my career so far, and I've made a lot of mistakes, right? Like I've done it poorly many times. And something I didn't do is I didn't rank the risk of the vulnerabilities I found. I just said, oh, we found all these vulnerabilities, now we need to fix all of them. And that was when I was first starting and I didn't really know what I was doing. Now what I would do is I would look at the risk, like Sandy just said, of the vulnerabilities itself, look at the business impact potential. But something I would also do is I would measure it against a tool like X Analytics, right? So X Analytics is this great tool that I use all the time, that I just really appreciate, because it helps you measure your corporate risk profile. And you can take a look at, okay, if the outcome of this threat model is that I fix XYZ vulnerability that has a large business impact, maybe I can reduce my risk profile by $50,000 or whatever, right? It puts a dollar amount to it, which will let business owners, business supporters, line of business sponsors pay more attention to this. So if you can put it in dollars, especially if your company is publicly traded, it goes a long way. So don't just measure it in terms of like CVEs or something like that. Measure it in terms of dollars and you'll have more success.
Yeah, I think that the dollars is another aspect, which I didn't think I'd be bringing up bug bounty yet again. But bug bounties at least do have that angle of this is how much we paid out. And so you can start to quantify it. There's a more familiar impact there than CVSS V4 calculators, which I won't try to make everyone figure out here. But part of that too is, I think the underlying aspect of what you're describing, Akira, is that if we're talking about dollar loss or trying to put numbers on something like in terms of dollars, that's because we're talking about the functionality of the application in the sense of, oh, here's an endpoint that deals with credit cards. And so attackers might be just seeing, is this credit card valid, or what's the limit of this debit card, or trying to do microtransactions to then go and say, oh, this is good, I'm going to go use it for a big transaction. And I think I'm trying to find a question here to bring you all back into this, but to me, this is really just what I want to emphasize about what is your application doing, and that's where to have that conversation. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if that's been easy or difficult, or that gets missed in the sense of we talked about like a checklist or framework. So maybe as I'm running out of trying to figure out how to turn that into a question, let me turn this into a question. If you're getting started, what are we building? And are there good go-to questions that you've had to help prompt those junior developers or people not familiar with threat modeling to figure out like, oh, that's what you meant by impersonation, or that's what you meant by dollar loss? Because it can be really easy to say there's a denial of service, or the system is down. But the system being down is just one part of that's just the A in CIA. So confidentiality, integrity, are these things you bring in too, or is it just good questions? Help me out with questions, I think, is what I'm struggling to get across here.
I'm gonna punt it to Kalyani, actually.
Here we go.
Punt.
I think, okay, I think it's a very broad how do you say, it's the question itself is too broad. Maybe Mike, you'll have to help me.
So this is great. Thank you for that. So this is a good example of like if you're the developer, I came to you and said what could go wrong, that's maybe doesn't seem as helpful. So maybe it is really that idea of, well, what happens if this type of user, what are we expecting users to do? Maybe that's a different phrase to do this. And you're helping us demonstrate to our listeners, what does a conversation, a threat modeling conversation go like? So we have, let's say, normal users who are buying widgets, putting them into their shopping cart, but we have sellers who are designing all the widgets on the back end and describing them. So this is a way maybe to say, oops, you did ask that really bad, overly generic question. Let's refine it a bit and try and figure out, what are you actually trying to get to here?
So an experiment I'm trying, and I'm not sure if this will work yet, is I am teaching a class to our developers and our security team once or twice a month. And I'm starting to do it now on one of the OAuth top 10 every time. My next one is going to be authentication and authorization. I want to show common exploits in auth systems. And through showing these common exploits, I think what I will do is fold it into a very simple mock application of, hey, you know what, if an attacker gets access to maybe this token or something like that in this particular area, then that's bad, and here's why. So I think if you can illustrate, my hypothesis is if you can illustrate an exploit first, as opposed to coming up with like a theory or a general best practice, that will help. Because again, devs spend all their time either in an IDE or in the dev tools. They're checking the network tab, they're looking at source code, they're working with linters, right? So if you can show them, hey, guess what? I was able to modify this request. And I got back the entire table of users, right? Or, I was able to brute force this password of 7 characters with a rainbow table and, 1 terabyte worth of memory, right?
You're very helpfully illustrating a great approach, because what I was coming from the idea of, show me where you, like, hey, Kalyani, are you worried about spoofing? Or where are the spoofing problems here? That's way too generic. And obviously that's a little bit of struggle. But if you take Akira's approach of, here's how a user could have spoofed and a request to be someone else, that starts to be more helpful with getting developers to think about, oh, that's what you mean. Maybe they already know these activities, they just don't have the language for it.
But although, like, I'm gonna make a little opposite side of the spectrum kind of response.
No,
Yeah,
great.
back, do it.
I feel like I haven't found a lot of success when I tried to go via the control approach. Like, hey, let's target this control
Yes,
today
thank you.
and see how we're going to go with it. I think what has been more useful, or maybe I was very fortunate to work with really good developers, was that there's almost always a sentiment where a developer would treat that product or feature like it's their baby, and then it was more of a conversation of what possibly could hurt this baby, and then we
I
go
like that.
from there,
Yeah.
rather
Yeah.
than the whole control approach. And I think that opens. I've seen it open so many options and doors which we did not see when we conventionally stuck to controls.
I love that, because as you're pointing out, the control approach just puts that narrow blinders on, well, what's the specific attack, rather than what did you actually build? And let's talk
Yeah.
about the developers who have that expertise on what they built. And honestly, where's the brittle part? Where's the creaky part? Where's the part they haven't quite finished yet? They'll start to tell you, oh, we care about this part of the baby. This is what could go wrong. Yeah, and so unfortunately, we're coming down to the end of our own time-limited threat modeling discussion. But Sandy, I'd love to come back to you with the idea of, you did this. You've got a paper now. You talked to a bunch of people.
I talked to Akira.
You talked to Akira. That's why one of the reasons we have her here. What were some of the process around that, or what are some of the things perhaps you just learned in general, talking across a wide variety of people doing this?
I mean, honestly, that's the most fun. The most fun part of my job is being able to reach out to practitioners and do these interviews and get a sense of what are the commonalities, what are the things that really stand out in terms of how to look at a particular problem. This time around, it was threat modeling. I've certainly done things on other aspects. What I think really stood out for me on this one, first was the notion just shattering the illusion that the framework's for everything. That stood out immediately. But I think the other thing, it was really nice to see so many folks that I spoke with taking a really pragmatic approach to, we don't want this to overwhelm the dev team. We want this to be focused on the business purpose of the application and then understand how that business purpose could be disrupted and how it could do damage to our business, because that's where that all comes back to. It's good, and obviously it's been an evolution over the years, but it was really good to see so many pragmatic approaches to this and an understanding of the role that security needs to play in this. That we are not, as I think Carielli said earlier, we're not the Department of No. We can't be the Department of No. We've got to be the Department of help you move faster.
Yeah. And so help you move faster. What's that? 4 words. That's going to lead me into wrapping up here. At the end, we've been asking all of our guests to describe AppSec, but in 3 words. So Department of No, that came up. But Akira, I'm going to come to you first. Since now you're in a guest seat, how would you describe AppSec in 3 words?
Magical, intimidating,
Okay.
and this is 2 words. Sorry, thought-provoking.
We'll pretend
There's a
there's a
dash.
hyphen in there. Yeah, we'll put a
Totally.
hyphen in there. And for you, Sandy, take us out with your 3 words.
All right, I'm going to preface this by saying this is aspirational perhaps, but this is where we should be going. Build safer, faster.
Love it. Build safer, faster. And perhaps that starts with threat modeling, which we've just had a wonderful discussion on. So I want to say thank you and Akira once again for joining us and helping out with a great conversation. Also want to say thank you to Carielli for making sure we got some great addition to this conversation and some good practical advice that comes out of it. Please do stick around. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.